Hello and welcome to the Microbehunter Microscopy Podcast. My name is Oliver Kim. Hi, Oliver here, and today I'd like to talk about the first microscope that I bought. My first microscope is an Olympus CH40. I think it's not manufactured anymore. I bought the microscope back in the year 1998, and I have to admit, it's still working perfectly, just like on day one, and so I'm really happy with it, of course. And one of the reasons why I'm making this episode is because I wanted to convince you that it is not always the technical specifications of a microscope that determines how good it is, but that there is also a strong emotional component involved here. A microscope is not good necessarily if it fulfills the top technical specifications, but I claim that a microscope is good if you use it as often as possible, if you have an emotional attachment to your device. I know that's a little bit of a different approach to the whole issue, but maybe it's useful. I don't know. Well, I will just tell you how I bought the microscope, and then I'll let you decide on whether you believe me or not. At that time, the CH40 microscope was advertised as a doctor's microscope. It has the DIN 160 millimeter standard. Olympus does not manufacture this standard anymore, I think, and it is it's a standard bright field microscope. The microscope has a trinocular head, so this means that I can also add a photo tube, and I can attach a camera quite easily to the microscope. The revolving nose piece allows me to connect 5 objectives, and the objectives that I have is a 4x, a 10x, a 20x, a 40x, and a 100x oil immersion objective. However, later on I exchanged the 100x oil immersion objective with a 60x objective because I think I'm actually using it more often. I just want to talk a little bit about how I bought the microscope. It was I was just finishing my university studies at that time, and I already planned for a long time to invest a little fortune in a new microscope, or in my first real microscope, so to say. I made the decision relatively early that I do not want to get myself a no-name microscope, but I rather wanted to have a good one. In other words, one that lasts a lifetime. It should also be as some kind of a present to myself after I finished my university studies, so I was quite willing to spend a little bit of money. And it did cost a little fortune, the microscope, as a matter of fact, is sold used today and for several thousand euros still. Now, if I were to buy a microscope again, or at least with my current, if I were to buy a microscope myself, I'd probably not spend that much money on it, I have to admit, because it's possible to also get a very good optical quality for significantly less. But at the same time, I have to admit, I don't really regret having spent that money because it is indeed a very, very good microscope. How did this actually work? At that time, I of course got myself pamphlets and information material from various companies that are offering microscopes. So among others, Olympus, Nikon, and so on. Also a couple of less known, no-name brands. And I chose relatively quickly. I decided to go for the CH40, also because at that time it was still a new model. It was, I think, relatively recently released. It was a good microscope, and at that time I was also interested in doing a lot of photography. So it had to have a trinocular head, and of course Olympus offered everything in their program. So what I did was the following. I rang up. I looked in the local telephone book. I was looking for the company, the Olympus representation, and I called them up. And then I made an appointment, and I drove by car. I just had the driver's license made, so I was able to drive around. And I drove by car to the office there, and to have a look at the microscopes that they had to offer. I was quite honest right from the beginning. I said I wanted to have a microscope for amateur reasons, and I would like to have a look at a few of these microscopes there. And I went there, and as indeed the gentleman over there, he welcomed me, and he already prepared two microscopes. It was I think if I remember correctly, a CH2 microscope, and also the CH30, which is the smaller brother of the CH40 microscope. The difference is that the light intensity is not quite as high, and it did not have curl illumination, but very similar in design. In any case, rather to the surprise of the of the gentleman, of the retailer over there, I was actually quite immediately. I said, okay, I want to go for the more expensive microscope. So I left the CH2 to the side and said, I want to have a slightly a larger one, more expensive one. He was a little bit surprised, I think, because for amateur usage, CH30 or CH40, that's already a pretty, I don't know, it's more than a normal average amateur would probably spend. And then basically I also asked him about the light intensity, and I said I want to do some photography, and then he basically said that the CH40 had a slightly stronger halogen light illumination. So I said, okay, that's basically what I want to have. Okay, and he was again a little bit surprised that I essentially always ended up upgrading a little bit the whole thing. And then I asked him the following question: is why do you actually always want to convince me to buy the cheaper one? Because he was actually always kind of always hinting towards and then saying, okay, why don't you just get the cheaper one? Yeah, so he didn't say that openly, but he was kind of always kind of directing me to, or not convince me really, but actually kind of also highlighting the advantages of the CH2 microscope, which is significantly cheaper. And then I asked him why he's doing that, and then he looked at me and says, yeah, the point is the following: we're not really interested in selling you the most expensive equipment. We want to make sure that you're really satisfied with whatever microscope you buy, because we're interested in a long-term relationship and so on, and we're not really interested so much in making quick money, but rather we're more interested in that you have you're satisfied with the microscope that you buy. So that is a little bit the thing that he said, but he also realized very quickly that my demands are a little bit more than, I would say, probably the average demands that of an average amateur microscope user. So that is a little bit the background, and then basically I signed the contract. I went for the CH40. I told him which objectives I want to have. I told him which eyepieces I want to have. He basically then noted that down, and then I had to wait for a few weeks because the microscopes had to be imported first. So he basically placed the order, and then after a couple of weeks, I got contacted, I think by telephone or so, that the microscope can now be picked up. So I went there again. I took along all of the cash. That time I still paid in cash. And then I picked up the microscope, and that was pretty much it. And then I took it home, of course, and then I started very happily to observe some specimens under the microscope. And I remember one of the first things that I observed was, of course, an onion skin, and I could see the little cell organelles moving under the microscope, and I was really so happy, I remember, because I could see all of these details. Basically, then I was hooked, of course, and that's how my amateur life as an amateur microscopist started. You might now wonder a little bit, why am I telling you all of that? Well, I think the point that I want to make is the following. If you look nowadays at the websites or catalogs that are offering or presenting the microscopes that you can buy, I think there is a very strong and a very strong emphasis on technology. I mean, it lists it gives you a whole bunch of technical details. And all the magnifications you can have is often very exaggerated magnifications, and often these microscope shops, at least the ones that I found online, have basically only very few models of microscopes, but essentially they blow up the selection of microscopes by fitting them with all possible combinations, and then kind of making it appear as if they have a huge selection, but in reality it's only the same model, only fitted with different objectives and eyepieces. So it's a very technology-centered or very technology-focused way of presenting microscopes. But when I bought a microscope, I actually had I would say almost a minimum number of, they had very few specifications. My main specification was really I want to take pictures with that. And that's basically and at that time, the only way to do that reasonably well was by buying a microscope with a trinocular head, and this already reduced my the selection possibilities a little bit. But I had a very subjective, emotional approach, and I chose the microscope based on on a non-rational emotional basis. This might not be the best way of choosing such an expensive device, but then on the other hand, I'm saying, well, it's a hobby, you know? You gotta like the microscope that you're using. And it doesn't really matter so much what the technological specifications are. The real thing that's important is that you like using the microscope. After all, it is a pastime. It is a hobby. It should give enjoyment. And simply, if you like the device, the microscope, because there is a personal attachment to it, then that's something very important. And if for example, if I could maybe sell my microscope and get myself a new one, maybe one that is able to do more. I don't know, some kind of some fancy contrasting techniques, or maybe one with infinity optics, which allows me to insert filters and I don't know what. Yeah, but I wouldn't do that because I'm personally attached to the microscope. So the advice that I can give to amateur microscopy beginners is to find a good balance between the actual specifications, so that you do have a slight idea of what you want to do with a microscope. But let's be very honest, with most microscopes you can observe anything pretty much anyway. To have a good balance between what you want to observe and also whether you subjectively like the device. I mean, and often it is like this, that you simply have to see the device and have to try it out, whether it kind of, I don't know, whether you're able to connect with it. So that is a little bit the how shall I say, the advice that I can give. And if you're not really sure, if you would really are interested in microscopy as a hobby, then I can advise you maybe not to spend too much at the very beginning. Don't go for the cheapest device either, okay? But go for one which is reasonably priced, one that you think you can identify with. One, I know it sounds kind of weird if I say it, but one who's the microscope whose looks you like. I mean, I've got my microscope standing here on the table, and I'm looking at it every day, so it's kind of a little bit part of my identity as well. So I think looks also plays an important role here, and if you simply get yourself a microscope that you can identify with, I think then this is also a very important part of the whole microscopy experience and the hobby experience. And then if you did not spend too much money on your first microscope and you already know what you're into which direction you want to take the hobby, then you can always buy yourself another one later on as well. I've taken the slightly riskier route maybe. I've decided to invest quite a bit at the very beginning. But at that time, I have to admit, I also did quite a bit of research, background research, concerning the different models that there are. Yeah, so but ultimately the decision was not an entirely rational one, I have to admit. It was largely also a subjective one, and I'll be very honest, I wanted to spend a little fortune because I told myself this is a present that I'm making myself to commemorate the finishing of my university studies. So in that sense, it had also this very subjective component to that. Yeah. So, well, that's pretty much it. A little bit. I don't know what you, I don't know if it's very useful what I'm telling you right now here, but I simply wanted to tell you a little bit the way that I've approached the purchasing of a microscope. Yeah, maybe I do want to add something. If you, for example, read forums or web pages about what's the best microscope to buy, very often, or not very often, occasionally you will hear the thing, well, you probably the best thing that you do is you get yourself a refurbished used microscope. Okay, that's what some people are saying. Then other people are going to say, well, no, you should not. You should buy yourself a new one, because if it's used, then there might be some problems with it. Okay, so better to buy yourself a new one. Then you're playing it safe. Then other people are actually saying, yeah, no, you should buy a no-name microscope because they're cheaper. Then others are saying, well, the no-name ones, they don't really have a resale value. You should go for one of the big four well-known microscope brands like Olympus, Zeiss, Nikon, or Leica. That's another view. And what I'm proposing here is just forget about this. go for the microscope. The best microscope is the one that you're going to end up using the most, okay? And at that time, for me, it was the Olympus CH40, which basically, yeah, which I'm very satisfied with. By the way, I'm not how shall I say? I'm not affiliated with the company at all. Okay, so just to make this clear, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend this microscope for everyone, because you can also get yourself a no-name microscope that you can get emotionally and personally attached to, and maybe that would be the thing that I would do nowadays with my experience that I have right now. I'd probably go for a significantly cheaper one. I'd basically fine-tune the microscope, and I'd set it up in a way that I can really take the pictures and the photographs that I want to take with it. So it's not, yeah. Nowadays I have a different approach probably to the whole thing. But at that time it was very important for me to have, I don't know, to have this particular one as a present to myself. And I don't regret it, I have to admit, but it's not something that I necessarily would recommend. What I do recommend is get a microscope that you can emotionally identify with. Okay, so I think that's the bottom line of this episode here. I wish you a nice day as always.